Welcome, everybody, to the 82nd show of the Jewish Drinking Show. I'm your host, Rabbi Drew Kaplan. I'm very excited to welcome first-time guest, Professor Joel Hecker, to the show. Professor Hecker, welcome.
Thank you so much. And it's really, it's fortuitous to be here on your 82nd show because the gematria of 82 is pay bet, which spells pub. So how less appropriate could it be for me to be appearing on this particular show?
That's great. That's great. So for those less familiar with Professor Hecker here, he serves as professor of Jewish mysticism and is among today's most prominent scholars of Kabbalah. He is the author of volumes 11 and 12 of the Zohar Pritzker edition, the first complete annotated translation of the Zohar, the central and canonical text of Jewish mysticism. And fun fact, that 11th volume won the 2017 Canadian Jewish Literary Award in the category of scholarship. He holds an HBA in English literature from the University of Toronto, rabbinic ordination. I'm sorry, you're also a rabbi, and MS in Jewish philosophy from Yeshiva University, and to top it all off, a doctorate in Judaic studies, specializing in Jewish mysticism from New York University. And he's also the author of Mystical Bodies, Mystical Meals, Eating and Embodiment in Medieval Kabbalah. And he's published a lot on all these different things, as one can imagine. Do you, by the way, in that book on mystical bodies, mystical meals, do you touch on wine or drinking much?
I do, but you know, the one of the things that is interesting about the way that medieval Kabbalah deals with food is that it's mostly interesting in it as so far as it's used for ritual purposes. So in other words, it's interested in challah, it's interested in matzah, it's interested in wine as kiddush, it's interested in, but it's not really interested, say, in beer. It's not interested in scotch. It's not interested in fruits and vegetables, except insofar as there may be mitzvot that are associated with them.
That's very neat, very neat. Okay, so speaking of drinking, before we get going, what are you drinking this evening?
So I've got a just a small bottle of Herzog that I opened up a little earlier, but I've saved some for my cup of kiddush so that I can, to use as a proper prop.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful. And just for those listeners out there, I've got some bourbon with me this evening, so that's what I'll be. Even though bourbon does not appear in the Zohar, so Professor Hecker is clearly more appropriately drinking for this session.
And which bourbon are you drinking?
Town and Branch. They're out of Lexington, Kentucky. So what are we talking about this evening, Professor Hecker?
So what I thought that we would talk about is, as I just mentioned, is that in the Zohar and in other Kabbalah that appears in the 13th century and 14th century, one of the primary ways in which they are thinking about wine is, and we'll be talking about wine, is in terms of kiddush, is in terms of the kos shel bracha, the cup of blessing. Cup of blessing technically refers to the cup that is used during Birkat HaMazon, during grace after meals. But the truth is that I believe that the way that the Zohar is talking about it and the other surrounding texts are talking about it is they're talking about any cup that is being used for ritual purposes.
So I have two things. One, let's take a step back. For those less familiar, even with this, I mentioned in your bio that the Zohar is sort of the central foundational canonical text of Jewish mysticism. Can you tell us a little bit more about this work of the Zohar?
Sure. So the Zohar is mysterious, not only in terms of its content, but even in terms of how it emerged, is that it started to be distributed in pamphlet form by a 13th century Kabbalist named Moshe de Leon in the 1280s and 1290s. And we can't pin down exactly who the author is, though it seems that he may well have had a hand in writing a lot of it or editing a lot of it. He wrote many of his own Kabbalistic works. And there was a whole circle in north central Spain, called the region called Castile, where there are Kabbalists working in a particular kind of style. Within a couple of hundred years, the truth is really within a generation, is people start to hear that there is a book called Zohar, or that there is material called Zohar. and everybody's ears prick up that there's this amazing material that ostensibly was written by Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. So Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is a fierce critic, and of course, very important early rabbinic figure in the 2nd century. And to have a Kabbalistic work written by somebody in the 2nd century that's been passed down for 1,100 years is a remarkable claim. People start to gather these different pamphlets together. Ultimately, it doesn't appear in the form that we have it today until 1558. That's the first time that it gets printed, 1558 to 1559, in 2 different towns in Italy, one in Mantua, one in Cremona. Among the many important things about the Zohar is that because of it's written not as a work of theology, but rather as a kind of mystical midrash, so that there's a way in which its literary style is familiar to readers. It's not the first work to begin to talk about Kabbalistic lore, but it is huge in scope, and it is quite beautiful and quite brilliant in terms of its exegetical style, in terms of its close readings of Tanakh, of Chazal, of medieval philosophical literature. And really what it's done is that it has, because it's the beneficiary of, at that point, thousands of years of Jewish thinking and writing, there's a way in which it weaves all of these things beautifully together. Things are concatenating one off of the other to create a system that is not just intellectual, but actually experiential. That if one uses Zohar Kabbalah as a way of reading Torah, as a way of davening, of doing one's prayers, of performing mitzvot, performing commandments, what it inevitably does is deepens one's experience by tying it into a much broader and ultimately cosmic system.
That's wonderful. That's great. And speaking of tying things into a broader mystical system, I'm interested in tying wine into a broader mystical system. Wine and Kabbalah. So we've got Kiddush, I guess, kicking it off, right?
Right. So I'm going to be talking about Kiddush and the cup of blessings somewhat synonymously. But before we even get there, I want to talk a little bit about the esoteric meaning of the word yain, the word for wine in the first place. I wanted to talk a little bit about privacy, secrecy, and mystery, because one of the things that happens if you drink too much, of course, is you might reveal things that you don't want to be revealing. And it's worth thinking about the distinction between these different things. The privacy, on the one hand, are things that are yours. They may be like your medical condition, or they may be things that you don't share with everybody, but they're not like shameful. Secrets in our culture very often are things that were they to be revealed, then it might be shameful. It might be damaging for you. But the same word that gets used for a secret and the word that gets used for mystery or enigma, the word is the word sod. And that's where we turn to a Gemara. There's 2 different Gemaras that quote this particular line that say, Nichnas yain yatsa sod, that wine enters and secrets emerge. So, of course, if you have a little bit to drink, in some ways it serves as a great lubricant to enable conversation, drop some of the boundaries, allow people to be more comfortable.
For those keeping score at home, the other one is an Erevin. I think it's 64B or 65A, thereabouts.
Yeah. But the problem, of course, is that perhaps it's not a good thing for a sod to emerge. And in fact, one of the central tensions around Kabbalah is that in many ways there was an attempt to keep this as an esoteric lore. Probably most of your listeners are familiar with the notion that you're not allowed to study Kabbalah until you're 40 years old. Now, that number 40 came from actually an Arabic tradition of keeping esoteric lore secret. And the very first time that age was used as a metric for restricting access to certain kinds of knowledge, certain kinds of study, was applied by the Rashba against studying the Rambam. So the Rambam is very far from being a Kabbalist. but he was interested in esoteric matters. And so the question of like, who are you going to share secrets with, and what kinds of secrets are available for the public? My own sense is that in today's world, when all you have to do is type in Kabbalah.com and you can get the entire Zohar online, that there's no secrets that I'm revealing. It's all out there. And all I'm trying to do is explain some of the stuff. And tonight's focus is about wine. In that previous slide where it says wine enters and the secret emerges, go ahead. It's all right.
Oh, yeah.
This is the line that precedes it. But it was important to see that first part, the second part of the sentence first, because here what we have, and I'm just going to read things in English just for the sake of expedience, is that wine is given with 70 letters and secret is given with 70 letters. What does that mean? What we're doing here is an ancient technique called gematria. Jews were not the only ones that did this, but these days Jews are the only ones that still do this to a certain extent. For many of us, gematria might feel like a kind of a hokey thing to be doing. People might even associate with Bible codes or some such thing. But the truth is that the beauty of gematria is that it is actually a poetic technique. What gematria does is that it assigns numerical values to each of the letters of the Hebrew alphabet. And then by finding numerical equivalences between different words, it yokes two different words together, creating a metaphorical relationship. So that in the same way that I might say that my love is like a rose, and on the face of it, that's absurd. What does that mean? My love is like a rose. What? It's like you got to be a botanist to understand my romantic life? Of course not. What it means is that my love is delicate, and that my love is beautiful, and that it's fragile and it's vulnerable, and that maybe it's a little bit prickly. So if we say that wine actually equals sod, that wine actually equals mystery, then what we've done is that we have opened up the possibility of thinking about wine having a more significant kind of valence. That in some ways, that what wine is that it is opening onto something that is secret, not just about some piece of information, but rather, as the Kabbalah is wont to do, rather about God's own self.
It's interesting to me. I'm glad you mentioned something about the obfuscation, as it were, because in the Talmud, there are certain things for Kiddush, and there are separate things for this kos shel bracha, this blessing cup, which is, as you mentioned, it was initially really intended for the cup that was for the Birchat Hamazon, the postprandial cup, and then it seems in the medieval era they just get mixed together. I know Rambam does it, so I'm glad you mentioned something about that, because they just come together as it's not a cup distinctly for Birchat Hamazon. It's just for anytime you're doing brachas for blessings, you have these requirements.
Right.
And by the way, I will also point out, you say 10 requirements, because the same page it also talks about 4 in brachot where we have this.
Right. Well, what you're gonna see on the next few slides is that I'm only going to be talking about 2 or 3.
Oh, good.
So because I want to cut to the chase of certain things that the Kabbalistic texts are going to focus in on. In this particular text, in the Tractate of Brachot, which is the first tractate of the Babylonian Talmud, Rabbi Zera said that Rabbi Abahu said, and some say that this was taught in a Braita, 10 things were said with regard to a cup of blessing. It's a whole long list. I've got elliptical dots to skip to cut to the chase. One takes it in 2 hands and places it in one's right and fixes one's eyes upon it. If you ever go to a Hasidic home or to homes that are influenced by a Hasidic tradition, very often one of the children will come to the head of the household, usually the man, and they will take the cup and they will place it in his palm. And then he will hold the cup of Kiddush like this. Stemmed Kiddush cups don't work so well for this, for this particular kind of practice. But what I want everybody to notice is it says, and places it in one's right and fixes one's eyes upon it, that there's going to be a certain kind of visual focus that's going to be emphasized here. And then we see the same thing being brought in the Rambam, in Maimonides, in his Code of Jewish Law, that he says, how does one do it? How does one make, and here he's speaking about Kiddush. And so this really speaks to your point about
where he obfuscates. He just mixes it all together, that this blessing cup is used for all cups involving blessings, including Kiddush here.
So he takes you take a cup with a certain measure called a revi'it, and here he says, you hold it in one's right hand, echoing the Talmud. But interestingly, he says, and does not assist the right hand with the left hand.
Wow.
Okay. And I want to draw careful attention to that as the Talmud didn't say whether the left hand plays a role or does not play a role, but the Rambam is saying, no, you're going to be holding it. You're going to be holding like this and keep your left hand away. This is a section from the Zohar, from a later stratum of the Zohar called Raya Mehemna. It's probably written in the early 14th century. It actually refers to the Zohar as Chibura Kadma'a, as the preliminary or the preceding composition. And here it gives a list of 10 rules regarding the cup of blessing. And here too, it says that you receive it in two hands, and then place it in the right one shall direct one's eyes upon it. So here it's really just an echo of the
Gemara, of the Talmud,
without any shift. A little bit further on, I'm going to talk about the role that the left hand is going to play. Receiving it in his two hands, just like the Torah, which came as 2 tablets, 5 utterances on one tablet, corresponding to 5 fingers of the right hand, and 5 on the second tablet, corresponding to 5 tablets of the left hand. So you're receiving it like this, and then making Kiddush like this. And I cut out part of the text, but it goes on to talk about how Torah was given, this is in Parshat Hazinu, that the Torah was given by God's right hand. And so that there's a way in which we are now sort of emulating God, that we receive it the same way that Moshe did on Mount Sinai, but then that ultimately we're going to be holding it the same way that God holds what? Not the 10 tablets, but the entire Torah.
I hope you've been enjoying this episode so far with Professor Rabbi Joel Hecker. I want to give you a sneak peek, actually, into next week's episode on medieval halacha and Gentile wine, featuring Professor David Friedenreich.
Maimonides carefully misreads the Gaonim. He wants you to think, when you read the Mishneh Torah, that he's not doing anything new. He wants you to think that what he's saying is in the Gemara, because the Gemara talks about resident aliens, and was affirmed by the Gaonim.
I hope you enjoyed that sneak peek into next week's episode. Now back into this episode.
So what I want to draw attention to here is the way in which our hands are now serving as symbols, and we are reenacting, we are performing the role of Moses. We are performing the role of God. Is that there's a different kind of consciousness, and this is why the wine or the bourbon comes in handy, that there's a different kind of consciousness that is being solicited here in order to be able to participate, to break the rules, as it were. And what are the rules we're breaking? We're breaking the rules of consciousnness, is we're stepping out of our normal personae. We are stepping out of our normal status as a way of performing as something in a different kind of reality. This text that I've offered here is from the very first page of the Zohar, or at least it's the very first text of the introduction. And it's an interesting place for a mystical text to begin. It opens with Shir HaShirim. You might have thought that it would begin with Genesis. Bereshit begins with a song of songs. Rabbi Chizkiah opened like a rose among thorns. So is my beloved among the maidens. So the Zohar asks, or Rabbi Chizkiah asks, who is a rose? Assembly of Israel. We need to parse this a little bit. Assembly of Israel, Knesset Israel, is a common term used to refer to the Jewish people, commonly used in the Talmud. In Kabbalah, it refers to Shekhinah, to the feminine manifestation of divinity. It is the the access point. It is the point of connection between God and ourselves. And it continues, for there is a rose, and then there is a rose. Just as a rose among thorns is colored red and white, so Assembly of Israel includes judgment and compassion. Let's just stop for a moment. In Kabbalah, everything in the natural world has symbolic meaning. Whether we are talking about trees or birds or the sky or the sun or the moon, or even a rose, it's going to be telling us something about how divinity, how Kadosh Baruch Hu interacts with the world. So when we say that there is a rose that is colored red and white, first it's important to know that there was a Rosa Gallica that was imported from Spain to the Middle East that is colored red and white. It has alternating petals, red and white. What are the significance of these colors? White signifies the sphira, the attribute of God called chesed, of loving kindness. And red signifies gvura, which means judgment, rigor, might, discipline, and constriction. You have these two different forces that are fundamentally opposed and yet ultimately need to be harmonized. And perhaps the easiest example to use to think about that necessity in Kabbalah is in terms of traffic lights in a city. If you have a city that has only green lights, so in other words, it's like Chesed, right? It's like great to have green lights, but if everybody has green lights, we're going to have like massive, traffic jams and, mayhem. However, if we only have red lights, right, everything is being stopped. There's rules all the time. Don't do this, don't do that. So just as a rose has 13 petals, so Assembly of Israel has 13 qualities of compassion surrounding her on every side. Similarly, from the moment Elohim, God, is mentioned, it generated 13 words to surround Assembly of Israel and protect her. What does any of this have to do with wine? What that text was doing is it's referring to these first verses of Bereshit, where if you count them, there are 13 words from the first iteration of the word Elohim until the next iteration. And 13, of course, is significant, 13 attributes of mercy, etc. But let's get to the wine cup.
Yeah.
So the text continues, then it is mentioned again. Why? What is mentioned again? The name Elohim. Why again? To produce 5 sturdy leaves surrounding the rose. So this rose has 5 leaves that hold it. Those 5 are called Yeshuot, salvation. They are 5 gates, Sha'arim. Concerning this mystery, it is written, I raise the cup of salvation. Now, when is it that we say that? We say that at Havdalah. So we're now sort of, invoking yet a different ritual with a wine cup. But we are talking about a kos of salvation, a cup of blessing. So he says, the Zohar says, this is the cup of blessing, which should rest on 5 fingers no more, like the rose, sitting on 5 sturdy leaves. Paradigm of 5 fingers. This rose is the cup of blessing. Okay, let's just break this down a little bit. What have we done now? Is we have compared the people of Israel and the Shekhinah, the feminine aspect of divinity, to a rose, to a cup of blessing, whose 5 leaves support that cup of blessing, and they are compared to the hand. And so to sort of shorten the equation, what we're ultimately doing is we are saying holding a cup of blessing is like holding the Shekhinah. Is that there is a way in which every time that we are making a bracha, that we say a blessing on Kiddush or Havdalah or at a wedding, what have you, that we are standing in a position in which we are taking responsibility for how divinity is manifest in the world. So a few pages later in the Zohar, it talks about how there are the number of words that there are in Kiddush. And it says there are 2 sanctifications we should recite. This is actually a child who gives this particular teaching in the Zohar's narrative. One is Vayechulu, and they that heaven and earth were completed. The other is Kiddush, sanctification. Vaychulu contains 35 words, and the Kiddush that we recite, the Zohar says, there are 35 words altogether. That's starting with the word Vaychulu, amounting to 70 names of the Blessed Holy One with which Assembly of Israel is adorned. So here you have the text of Vaychulu, and we're not going to all count this together. Everybody can pull a Siddur off of their shelf and check it out. But what we have there are 35 words. Now what we have is in Kiddush, we have a 35-word version of Kiddush. Now, let's take a close look.
Did they have a 35-word version?
Exactly.
Okay.
Okay. Now, what I would invite you all to do is if you take out your Siddurim or your benchers or what have you, you'll notice, of course, that we're leaving out the Bori Priya Gafen. Well, okay, Bori Priya Gafen you can say any day of the week. But what we are also leaving out is we are leaving out the words Kihu Yom Tchila. So at the end of the second line, leaving out those three words. And we are also leaving out Kivanu Vacharta Ve'otanu Kidashta Mikol Hamim, okay, which talks about Israel's chosen us. Now, I like to make the joke that this is because the Zohar and then Isaac Luria were anticipating Reconstructionism. I teach at the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College as the lone Orthodox faculty member. But that's not the case. It's just that the Arizal and the Zohar were saying, like, chosenness is not what Shabbat is about. Shabbat happened on the seventh day of the week before there was any talk about Jewish people. So what you find in many Sidurim of Nusach Sfard, that is, Hasidic Sidurim or amongst Sfaradim, is they will leave out those words. This way you get 35 words in Vaychulu, 35 words in the Kiddush itself. So what? So now we got 70. What's important about 70? Well, 70 is everything.
Well, it's Yayin and Sod.
Exactly. So Yayin equals 70.
Yeah.
But also we know that there were, according to the Talmud, there were 70 languages and there were 70 nations and 70 people, 70 figures in the Sanhedrin. In other words, that 70 is a number that suggests totality. So that if we are making Kiddush and we're holding our cup, which is a symbol for Shekhinah, and we are saying a number of words that corresponds to the totality of everything that are called crowns that are being put onto Shekhinah, what are we trying to do? Is that it's not merely that we're saying these words, and we're not merely fulfilling a halachic requirement. Really what we're trying to do is we're trying to restore God's glory to the greatest that it can be and give the Shekhinah her due.
Wow. And also 35 is half of 70 because you're only using one hand versus two hands. But yeah.
Oh, that's interesting.
I thought that's where you're going with that 35 we're holding in one hand. And if we were to hold in both hands, we would actually get 70. And that's really the big target number. I thought that's what you're going for.
Yeah, no. Is we got 35, we got 35, we got 70 altogether. We moved from it receiving it in two hands, which was the 10 corresponding 10 commandments. So there's all kinds of links that are going on here in terms of our possible covenant that we can be having.
Hello, dear listeners. It's your host, Rabbi Drew. I wanted to break in right now and just say, hey, thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate, or watching, however you're consuming this content. And I'm always open for new ideas, both for specifically the Jewish Drinking Show, whether it's topics, whether it's guests. I'm also looking for other resources that I can provide you with in the Jewish Drinking Project more broadly. Also, I'd really like to offer you the opportunity to sponsor this work. Whether if you want to go to patreon.com/Jewish Drinking, I would greatly appreciate it. And if you have ideas for swag, also, please feel free to send them to me at drew@jewishdrinking.com. All right, thank you so much, L'chaim, and now back into the episode.
It says, Yishakeni minishkot pihu, let him kiss me with the kisses of his mouth. Ki tovim dodecha miyayin. Because your love or your caresses or your kisses or your lovemaking is sweeter or is finer or is better than wine. Now, if you pay attention to the Hebrew, the prefix before the word yayin, the mi that appears there, is its simple meaning. The pshat is that it means than. It's sweeter than wine.
Mm-hmm.
However, let's talk about the left hand and the right hand so that we can circle back to the beginning. I showed you a Zohar text that says that you hold a cup in your right hand. But there's another Zohar text that says that you should support it with the left hand. In other words, in opposition to the Rambam. Now, it's not only that the Kabbalists like to stick it to the Rambam when they had their opportunities, and they do. But it's also, thinking back to the traffic light metaphor that I gave before, you need to have green lights and red lights. You need to have chesed and gvura. So we're not going to give gvura, we're not going to give the side of discipline, of harshness, of judgments, the starring role or the primary role. We're going to give that to chesed. And yet we know that we need to have the gvura in there as well, that when we're bringing Shekhinah into the world, we need rules. It can't just be love, okay? Even if we want to think about God as love, it's like God's not only about love, but of course it's the balance that's tricky. What the Kabbalah is advocating is a certain kind of balance between those two that privileges the right,
but still also balanced out by the left to some degree.
That's right. And yet it's not an equivalent balance, but it's one in which the left is providing support. It's like the best supporting actor, at the Oscars.
And so the using the mem here in this verse from Song of Songs is for saying from instead of the sort of the literal, more than. And so that they use that for the supporting the left.
So what exactly? In other words, that your love is sweeter from wine. Your love is sweeter when it's also coming from wine. In other words, that we think of love as coming primarily from the right, of being about chesed. And what we need to do is it's not talking about tough love. That's not what we're doing here. What we're doing here actually is that we are trying to raise up the side of harshness, as we're trying to find that tough part in ourselves and bring it into line with love, so that the love is sweeter when it is from wine. And that's actually, I think is the perfect place to leave us, is that what the Kabbalah wants us to do is not to be divulging secrets that shouldn't be divulged, but and not to become shikar, God forbid, but rather to be bringing things into a certain kind of harmonious service of a higher purpose.
Thank you. I have a couple of questions. So one, How often does wine pop up throughout Zohar more broadly?
So this is actually something that your previous guest, Professor Putsu, brought up.
Okay.
That in earlier Kabbalah, it primarily comes up in the performance of rituals, and it doesn't come up that much. I mean, if I open up my book under wine, there's like a handful of references. There's not that many. What ultimately takes place as history moves forward, particularly once you get to the Hasidic movement, is the Hasidim are into materiality writ large.
So that's later on, but in the Zohar itself, so it's mainly confined to Kiddush primarily, and then maybe a couple other ritual, maybe
Kiddush,
Havdalah.
Havdalah, 4 cups at Pesach time, and the Kos Shel Bracha. That's basically it. There may be, I don't know, maybe there are 20, maybe there are 30 references in several thousand pages.
So it's fairly limited.
Yeah.
And then you did mention also getting drunk. Does the Zohar ever mention drunkenness or getting drunk? Aside from, Purim maybe? Passover Seder? Does it ever mention it?
That's a great question. These guys are pretty hardcore. They're pretty serious. They're pretty sober in both senses of the word. In one of the texts I was looking at and preparing for today, they brought up a verse from Yirmiyahu, from the prophet Jeremiah, that refers to drunkenness. And you can imagine that in the prophet Jeremiah, that's not a favorable description.
Yeah, whenever drunkenness gets mentioned in the prophets, it's not usually favorable.
No, no. And the truth is drunkenness is not usually a great place to be.
It deserves its own separate study.
Okay. Fair enough.
That's a topic for another time.
Right.
But yeah, I was curious about, because you mentioned, so I was curious about in the Zohar. Professor and Rabbi Hecker, thank you so much. This is really insightful. I appreciate it. And hopefully our listeners appreciate it as well. Insights into the Zohar, Kabbalistic insights into wine, especially around the Kiddush and the cup of blessing. So I appreciate it. Do you have anything you'd like to promote? I mentioned at the outset of the show, the episode, that you have a book that involves consumptive activities, eating, and I presume drinking, right?
There are references, to be sure, to wine, to the wine of Torah, to the wine of eternity, the wine of the world to come. There are no references to other kinds of liquor, not even beer, I don't think. It's a shaker.
Oh, wow.
But yeah, so my first book was called Mystical Bodies, Mystical Meals, Eating, and Embodiment in Medieval Kabbalah. It was really trying to get at the question of human identity and the way in which the human being, the Jew specifically, interacts with the material world. And thinking about foodstuffs was a good way to get at that question.
That's great. Have you dealt with other consumptive activities, food or drink, in any other works, writings?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a number of different articles that I've written in different places. There is a piece that I published, a short translation of the Me'orei Naim, who is a Hasidic thinker in the 18th century. In fact, a complete translation of his primary work was just published by Art Green. I published a short passage dealing with a certain kind of eco-spirituality, is what I referred to, the way in which, through the course of one's eating, things that have come into the world by virtue of God's speaking of them into being, that with the right kavanah, that with one's study and with one's prayer, the one that raises them up. So there's a certain kind of cycle that takes place of letters and words coming down into the world, letters and words going back up into the world, specifically through consuming.
Wow. That's very neat. Very neat.
Yeah.
All right. Well, Dr. Rabbi Hecker, thank you so much for everything. And L'chaim.
L'chaim. Pleasure to be here with you this evening.
Yeah, this is great.
L'chaim, everybody.
L'chaim.